People are always interested in tin ceilings. And people notice tin ceilings because we still have them. Ye olde restaurants are always putting up tin ceilings. And, we see a lot of tin ceilings, but it's not something people know that much about. And in fact, as I discovered, many of these patterns have been being made for a century and a half, and so it's hard to date by pattern. But there are tin ceilings all over. There's tin all over the place. So one thing we thought we could ask people is, well, how many patterns of tin do they see? But there is actually one major pattern of pressed metal ceiling. Then there's a patch, because if something happened, they patched it, but they didn't bother to try to match. So there is one here, one here. There's another one on the walls. So they're all different patterns of this pressed metal. But one of the interesting things that the educator will have to explain to people is that there are layers of paint underneath the tin on the ceilings, which is evident that the pressed metal was not original. And then to ask, well, why would you put the metal up on the ceiling? And to talk about how, from a landlord's perspective, you, of course, were trying to cut costs all the time. Gravity and age deteriorated plaster ceilings, and they had to be replastered, they had to be repainted. So what could be more advantageous than to just cover the whole thing over with metal? And then you didn't have to worry about it. You didn't have to worry about the plaster deteriorating or painting it every few years. And so the tin gets put on later in the 19th century on the ceilings and on the walls as well. An important thing that we want people to be able to do when they take this tour is use their eyes. And how can you interpret the building and learn about the building by just using your eyes carefully? And one of the things that is easy for people to really grasp about tuning your eye in, which won't be so easy for you because it's hard to see on this picture, is that the stair railing is original. It's an 1860s stair railing. But the stair treads, that is the top of the stair, they're not original. And you can tell that they're not original because often the stair tread has a little nose on it, that little curved part in the front. So on the wall, there's where the tread is tucked into the wall. It's cut out, and the area where the nose would is actually cut out deeper than the present stair. So there's a little space over here that makes it very evident that there was a longer tread. There was a deeper tread originally than there is now. And you can actually, it's very vivid once you tune into it. So this is a way for people to kind of tune their eyes in to how they can read the building or a building and discover the history of change in the building. Oh, here you can see some of the tin. There's one pattern. There's a patched pattern. And there's a wall pattern. So the other thing is the wall. This is the thing that people are always amazed about when they go in. The walls are not plaster, and if you look really carefully at them and you begin to really stare at them, you realize what they are. They're burlap. And people are often startled that somebody would put burlap up on the walls. And they put the burlap up for the same reason they put the metal up. There are layers of paint behind the burlap, and the burlap was there so they wouldn't have to be repainting the walls. And of course, the walls in the hall get a lot of wear to them. And if you look really carefully at a few spots, you can see that the burlap was originally red, and then later it was got this kind of cream paint on it, and then it was decorated with what I call the plaster equivalent of a cake icer. Somebody just went and decorated them, and then there are the little murals on them too, a real puzzle. So burlap, really curious. Why would anybody put burlap on the wall? Well, then you begin to look at the literature for wall coverings from the early 20th century and find out that burlap was actually considered an artistic wall covering. And this is from a 1906 House Beautiful article. Wall hangings, their comparative cost and beauty. And it says, the color of the wall once determined, the question of treatment next arises. Time has passed when wallpaper alone was the solution. Burlap, and then it gives these great trade names. Textadorna, I love that. Fabriocona, and other things are used. And it talks about how it's very durable, how you could paint it. And there's a section about how you apply it to the wall. And this was a sort of arts and crafts idea. It gave you texture, it gave you color. And so burlap wasn't such an odd choice to have made in about, we assume about 1905, when the storefronts were put in, is when the burlap came out. But you have to do a little bit of documentary research to come up with evidence that burlap was a popular material at the time. And I have to say, when I was in graduate school, I lived on 109th Street in an apartment with really deteriorated plaster, and I hung burlap too. So I was either behind the times or ahead of the times when I did that. But who knew I was going to be researching burlap at some point? So from the hall, the group will be torn away from the hall and go upstairs to the rear apartment on the north side, which is one of the apartments on the second floor that's in unrestored condition. And this will be a place first to introduce the idea of the floor plan of the building. Using the iCard, which had the plan, you can see the size of the rooms, and it has where there were door openings, where there were window openings, and the placement of 1, 2, 3, 4 apartments in the building. And then with that, begin to look at the physical form of this small apartment, because this is an apartment that's close to its original layout. And talk about whether it's crowded or roomy. And I've taken students here, and somebody said to me, "Oh, it's bigger than my apartment." And that of course is true if you're living there by yourself.
Right.
But if you're living there with 9 other people, plus all their stuff, and you think of those old pictures with feather beds and all this stuff. It was pretty crowded. And then maybe there'll be 11 people on the tour, and 11 is the largest number of people in an apartment that the census has discovered. So it gives you an idea of how crowded these buildings were, even with nothing in this apartment. And then once people tune in, they begin to notice some of the oddities of the apartment. Like, why are there windows in the walls? This is this is the kitchen. This is the parlor, the kitchen, and the bedroom. So this is from the kitchen looking into the bedroom, and this is from the kitchen looking into the parlor. Mm-hmm. And there are windows cut into the wall, but they're actually not the same size windows. Also, you can look out the window, and you'll discover it's bright and sunny, and there's absolutely nothing blocking the light in the back. But here's 97 Orchard Street, and look, this is Allen Street, and there was a whole block of tenements there before Allen Street was urban renewed in the 1930s. So it was a lot darker than it looks. Plus, there were toilets back here, and undoubtedly there were toilets back here as well. So looking out the back wasn't necessarily the most pleasant view. But we've already talked about the fire ladders and the fire escapes. Well, they weren't the only means of egress. In the back, there's a fire balcony. And the idea behind this, still totally legal, and you still find it in lots of buildings, new buildings too. In case of fire, you're supposed to knock on the windows of your neighbor. And this does not seem very efficient way of getting out to me. But this is a typical New York form on the fire balcony. And this is the back facade, which people didn't see. It wasn't publicly visible. So what did people use it for? Storage. This was completely illegal, putting all this stuff on here. But of course, that's what would have been on the rear. But of course, the most curious thing are the windows here. And this is where to introduce the idea of what you can learn by doing paint research, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But when this project began, I read all of the building laws and what was required at various dates. And in 1901, there was when the Tenement House law was passed, the New York State Legislature debated whether or not they should ban interior bedrooms. And they voted to ban them. And in 1901, so that this kind of bedroom would be totally illegal. But the owners of the buildings complained about a lot of things. Mostly the state legislature did not listen to the landlord's complaints. But in this case, they did. And in 1902, they amended the law, and they permitted the interior bedrooms as long as there was a window cut in the wall between the kitchen and the bedroom. So every wall actually had to have a window cut in it, so that the idea was at least some air would get into the I don't know about light. No. It was awfully far for light, but at least air, there'd be some ventilation here. So we assumed that this was cut in 1901, but the paint research showed us otherwise. By investigating the layers of paint and comparing the number of layers on the woodwork here with the number of layers on woodwork elsewhere, it became very clear that these were original to the building. So that these were put in before they were required by law. But we didn't know that at the start of this project. The other mystery is, you'll notice there's a door back here. This door connects the bedroom of one apartment with the bedroom of the next apartment. Here it is here, and here it is here. So this was a real curiosity. Every apartment on the north side of the building still has one of these. And on the south side, they did originally, but those have been altered. And it was documentary research that showed that this was mandated as a fire code issue. In case of fire, you could also open that door and run into the next apartment and go out the fire escape in the front. Now, did this work? No, I don't think it did, because this was the bedroom, and it's really small. And you can imagine that for the door to swing, it meant that there was nothing in front of it. And of course, there was a bed or a chest or something in front of it. So I don't think it was an efficient way of getting out, but nonetheless, it was required by law, and they put them in, and they're still there. Okay, so then we're going to move to the apartment next to it on the rear of the south side. And this is the key apartment for interpreting finishes, because it has an amazing array of finishes from the beginning of the building in the 1860s until the building was closed in the early 1930s, and they're all there, and they're all visible even in the ruinous condition that this unrestored apartment is in. This apartment on the south side is the first thing people will notice that they'll be asked about is, what's the difference between this apartment and the previous one? Well, this apartment is considerably smaller. And you can actually see this on the plan. This is the apartment we were just in, and this is the apartment that we're in now. And that's because in 1905 they put in toilets, so that the educator will have to explain this. And here are the toilets, and the toilets basically took up space in the inner bedroom. So why, basically, the inner bedroom became a space that was too small to use? So why did they move all the walls? Did they move this wall, rather, to shrink the size of the kitchen to give you a bedroom? So this is a question, I think, that people will be interested in discussing. And of course it had to do with the fact that you could rent a 3-room apartment for more money than a 2-room apartment. So they created this minute little bedroom here, overlooking the toilet shaft, which is here. So the apartment is smaller, but the apartment is filled, as I said, with issues about the finishes of the building, the history of the building, that will be really interesting for people to interpret. The first and one of the most interesting issues deals with paint. There are the early paints in the building were distempers, that is, they're water-based paints, and they were bright colors. And there are places in this apartment where you can see large swatches of the original paint here, like this blue paint here. If you were wealthy and you put these distempers on your walls, you probably washed them off every year and redid it again. But of course they didn't do that here. They just covered them over. And so there are places where you can still see them. And then you can see the layers of oil paints here. So one of the big, this blue is actually, it's right in here. One of the really interesting issues is about the issue of paint stratigraphy. And what does that mean? What does it mean to do research on paint? So one of the things we're hoping to do is have some sort of exhibit, maybe not in August, but eventually, that will show how paint is, show the layering of paint, and how conservationists and experts on paint take get a little chunk of the paint, and they can read all the layers. And this is what they get. Each of these is a layer of paint here, and how this was then used to help determine colors, to date things by comparing the number of layers in one place with the number of layers in another place. Helps you to understand what was original and what was later. Or in the case of the sinks, for example, which we'll talk about in a minute, you can count the number of layers under the sink, or the number of layers under the burlap, or under the pressed metal, to help determine when those elements, the metal, the burlap, the sinks, were added. The other major finish is wallpapers in the tenement. Wallpapers began to inexpensive mass-produced wallpapers start appearing in the 1880s, and they start appearing at the tenement. It's not clear if the landlord put them up or the tenants put them up when inexpensive papers made of pulp become available. But there are places where there are 20 or more layers of wallpaper in the building, even though reformers wanted the wallpaper to be ripped off before a new layer was put on, because they thought that vermin would breed behind them. But that was expensive, so they just plastered another layer of wallpaper up. So having a display that shows the layering of wallpaper, the different designs, some in colors and patterns that we wouldn't think about today, the contrasting colors that, what did these look like under gaslight and not under electric light? So there are a lot of issues with wallpapers. Actually, the wallpaper expert Reba Fishman, who's working on this project, has put together a book with the 20 layers of wallpaper that you see over here, which I'll pass around, and you can actually see something of the variety of the wallpapers that are being used. So we're going to take a chunk of this and then display all the layers of wallpaper to give you a really vivid idea of what was here, and then how it was used, how valuable it is as an interpretive tool. Also, the floors are linoleum, and I think this is one of the things that, to me, is most interesting, because I think if one asks anybody, well, what's your first reaction to a linoleum floor, they'll scoff at the idea of that cheap linoleum on the floor. Yet linoleum was an inexpensive way of getting something really fancy and colorful, and it was also considered to be a progressive material. It was marketed as easy on women's feet in the kitchen, easy to clean, and in an incredible variety of patterns. And you can see the Persian rug patterns and the geometric patterns, what I call the Mondrian patterns. But what is linoleum? I don't think many people know what linoleum is. And linoleum is a linseed oil on a fabric. And it's usually on burlap. So here we go back to burlap. And actually, if you look closely over here, you can actually see the burlap sticking out of this one over here. So this is kind of introducing a material, a beautiful, progressive material that we don't think about as in a positive light any longer. And look how vibrant the colors are here. And using advertising, you really get a feel for what linoleum was, what the idea behind linoleum were. So here's the family. The little girl's just spilled some milk. But it doesn't matter because it's so easy to clean. Oh, mother, you can't see where I upset my milk last night because it was cleaned up and it's gone. Here it's a Persian rug pattern, sort of like this one over here. And these were in all kinds of magazines. They were in home magazines like Good Housekeeping, in Saturday evening, the Saturday Evening Post. But interestingly, I found, I don't have it here, but there's a linoleum ad from Country Life, which you think of as an elitist magazine, but clearly it wasn't only the elite that were buying Country Life. And so linoleum even appears there. And here's one of the geometric patterns. Working hours fly in kitchens like this, because it's easy on the feet to be in here. And then the most obvious thing that one sees when one goes into many of these apartments are the tub sinks here. And you have to wonder, well, what are they made of? Where did they come from? Why are they here? And when were they put in? Of course, when were they put in is still the big mystery. Here, the history of plumbing is a little ambiguous. Probably about 1905. That's, I think, what our latest idea is. And they're made out of soapstone, which is holds water really well. It's very, very durable. And one thing that one notices as you poke around, and which everybody on the tour will notice because everybody's going to have a flashlight with them, so they can look really carefully at things, is there's a little round panel over here, and it says Alberine stone, best. So Alberine stone, well, Alberine stone, is a company. And the Alberine Stone Company made these sinks, and this was our leader. This was their best seller. It was also the cheapest thing they sold. And so talk about how everything, when something was done here, it was always done in the least expensive way possible. And that's really evident here, that they bought the cheapest sink, and they actually bought the cheapest legs as well. The legs sold separately, but these are the cheapest legs that are here. And there's this little plaque here, and there it is on the sink. So
that sink wasn't original?
No, not original. There was no water originally. Water was in a pump in the backyard, even though water was available on Orchard Street. The owner chose not to hook in, because you had to pay if you hook in, so they chose not to. And it was below the standard even for the time, because descriptions talk about how many tenements had one spigot on each floor in the hall, but they didn't hear. And there was probably no water until 1905. So then we're going to take these ideas and move into the apartments and look at what was done right and what was done wrong. So this is the Gumboots Apartment. This shows a German immigrant, tells a story of a German immigrant woman who runs a seamstress shop here after her husband has abandoned her. And this was the first apartment that the museum did, and it's the Gumboots lived here in the 1870s, so we're going to ask people to look around, and then we're going to ask them, well, what's wrong with this apartment? Well, the first thing that's wrong with this apartment is there was no wallpaper here in the 1870s, and it's beautifully wallpapered so that it looks like your grandmother's parlor, and it wouldn't have been wallpapered when Natalie Gumboots lived here. So that's wrong. Also, the graining's too dark. Here, it's all this faux graining, but more recent research has shown that the graining was a lighter color. So this would have had calcimine or distemper paints originally on the walls, and not this. But even though this room is wrong, the work on creating this apartment uncovered one of the greatest surprises. And then I said at the beginning, you always have to be tuned in to something that's unexpected. And that is when they started working on this, they discovered this scar on the ceiling that indicated that there was once a wall here. And what this indicates is that probably in about 1905, when the water and the sinks were put in, the kitchens needed to be bigger for the space to hold those Alberine stone sinks. So they moved the walls, and they increased the size of the kitchen, and they shrunk the size of the living room. And that was evident in this scar here, where it was very clear that there was once a wall. So for this apartment, because it's in the 1870s, the wall was moved back, but this was left as something to help explain the history of the space. Well, there's one other mistake in this apartment, and that is there's no window between the kitchen and the bedroom. Because when this was done, we just assumed that they followed the law, and in 1901 they cut those windows in. But then when the paint research was done, it became clear that they were original. And so here's one that's still extant in its original form. And they had sliders. The windows slid left and right. Whereas the windows between the kitchen and the parlor, which were added in the early 20th century probably, are sash windows that go up and down. So here you can see what it should be, and here you can see what it is over here. And of course the issue is, should this be left or should this be restored? Again, especially with in an institution with a limited budget. I mean, what do you do with something like this that was initially interpreted and now you know more? But, well, you can do it right in another apartment, and this is the Moore apartment, which is the most recent museum apartment, and you can see there's the sliders. There are calcimines on the wall. Here there's blue calcimine on the wall, which is closer to the way that this would have been when the building was occupied. And you'll also see, though, that a decision was made very early on not to hide any modern things that had to be put in to make this a museum that people could go to. So you can see the sprinklers that were put in by the museum, and there's no effort to hide them somewhere. They're just part of the continuum of change that this building has gone through. So then the tour is going to end in the backyard, where there's been the reconstruction of the outhouses, the compartments for the toilets in the backyard. And it also shows you the problems with documentary evidence. Documentary evidence, everything needs to be proven, even with a document. Because here's the I-card. And the I-card shows the apartments that we've seen, and then the person the inspector who did the I-cards in 1902 was nice enough to draw in exactly where the toilets were. Except that when the museum did an archaeological dig to find evidence of the toilets, they started right here at the southwest corner to find the toilets, because of course that's where they were, and there clearly were 6. Well, there was no evidence at all of anything in this corner. So they moved elsewhere, and lo and behold, that's where the toilets were, over here. And so who knows why the inspector did it wrong. Maybe he just didn't feel like going into the backyard that day because he was tired, and he just drew it in, because everybody else had 6 toilets in that location. But anyway, it was wrong. And here's the archaeologist, and there's the pit that they found, the privy vault, the brick privy vault that they found over here. And so using the space that was discovered for the privy vault and using old images like this one, these have been reconstructed over here. So this is all about bringing all kinds of interpretive tools together to help interpret the buildings, to help people understand the building. So that's the tour that we're planning. It'll take about 5 hours per tour to get through it. Lunch will not be served. But anyway, I'm happy to answer questions. Yes?
When they built this building, do you think the builder had any idea how long the building was expected to exist?
No, and I suspect that they didn't think that it would exist this long. It was built to minimum standards.
That's what I was thinking.
They were building for profit at the time. They weren't thinking in the long term. Mm-hmm. They were thinking in the short term. And I don't think that that's just true of tenements, though. When I teach New York architecture, and we talk a lot about row houses, and we talk about speculative builders And if you would ask those speculative builders that put up those Italianate houses in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill whether they thought that their row houses would be revered landmarks 150 years after they were built, they would have laughed at you. You know, they were speculative builders, and they were out to build something cheap and make a profit, and then they didn't care what happened after that. And I think that was true here. In this case, actually, interestingly, the builder, Lucas Glockner, actually held on to the building for several decades, whereas many others just sold them immediately. Yes?
I would just add a comment to that, because very recently I did a tour for a college group, but they were kind of like future construction workers and plumbers of America, who were kind of poking around our building. And they said, well, the stuff we're building now, you're not going to be doing a tour of in 170 years. So they were impressed with the solidity.
Well, that's really, I mean, that's a really interesting issue, that these buildings, the tenements and the row houses from the mid-19th century, have lasted so long because the quality of the material, the basic quality of the materials and the construction was better. And also they'd never, in the 1860s, they'd never heard of value engineering, you know, building anything to its absolute minimum. I've read the statistic, but I can't remember what it is, of how many times the Brooklyn Bridge is overbuilt. And like you could snip off 3/4 of the iron supports and it would still be perfectly fine. And they just didn't know how to build it in the cheapest way. That now we would. We'd build it to the minimum.